The Arctic air was sharp, the sky a sheet of frozen silence. At 0412 GMT, 3 squadrons of Soviet MiG-25 interceptors roared into the high atmosphere from Rogachevo Air Base on Novaya Zemlya. Their mission, a high-altitude patrol to shadow NATO reconnaissance routes, skimming the northern edge of Soviet airspace. It was routine. It was rehearsed. It was monitored. Until it wasn't. Inside NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, radar operators watched the MiGs streak across their scopes, sharp. Metallic pulses moving at Mach 2.8, then, without warning, they disappeared, not turned, not faded, vanished. All 3 radar signatures blinked out in unison, across 2 separate radar networks, one airborne, one ground-based. At first, controllers thought it was a glitch. Then they cross-checked AWACS feeds. Same result. No MiGs, no return. The alert level was raised. NORAD officers began cross-referencing with other radar grids. But every query returned the same answer. No tracked data. To them, it was impossible. Fighters don't vanish mid-flight, especially not supersonic interceptors designed to slice through the stratosphere. And never, 3 at once, inside the Soviet Union. Air Defense Command in Severomorsk was already monitoring the patrol, feeding positional updates from their own PVO radar systems. And they too noticed something, a sudden break in synchronized track alignment. To the Americans, it looked like a new Soviet jamming or stealth capability. To the Soviets, it looked like their fighters might have been downed or defected. The silence stretched. 7 minutes passed. NORAD considered scrambling intercepts from Alaska and Greenland. Soviet SAM batteries in the Kola Peninsula were armed. Both sides prepared for what they thought could be the first hostile act in the skies since the U-2 crisis. And then at 0421, just as suddenly as they had disappeared, the MiGs reappeared. Exact altitude, exact velocity, same heading, no change in course, no damage, no transmissions. Just a silent return to the scopes, like ghosts phasing back into the world. No one fired a shot. No official record was kept. But behind the scenes, both sides launched emergency reviews of their systems. What had made the MiGs disappear? And if it had happened by accident once, could it be triggered on purpose for years? The Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO Strany, had operated under a doctrine of absolute coverage. Their radar network was vast. Dnieper and Dogovo phased array systems ringed the western frontier, while P-14 Tall King and P-35 Barlock, early warning radars, covered the Arctic sectors. When radar coverage overlapped, gaps weren't just unlikely, they were considered impossible. These systems were built to detect incoming American bombers, cruise missiles, and reconnaissance aircraft before they even approached the border. Every inch of Soviet airspace, especially near sensitive polar patrol zones, was assumed to be visible, traceable, trackable. Friendly aircraft, like the MiG-25 squadrons that vanished, were tied into this network through IFF identification, friend or foe transponders, and direct uplinks to PVO Regional Command. These weren't just fighter jets. They were pieces of the radar grid itself, flying sensors designed to extend awareness beyond the fixed arrays. So when 3 entire squadrons vanished, from both American and Soviet radar, in the middle of a standard patrol, doctrine couldn't explain it. It wasn't a breach. There were no hostile aircraft. No radar jamming signatures were recorded. There was no loss of power, no solar flare, no mechanical failure logged before takeoff, which meant the first assumption was it wasn't real. The radar systems must have glitched somewhere between the northern stations and Central Command. Data packets had scrambled, processors lagged, or a synchronization signal failed to propagate, but those were technician problems. In Moscow and Colorado Springs, The generals and analysts didn't speak in ones and zeros, they thought in threats, and any event that caused 3 aircraft to vanish simultaneously could not be ignored. If this was electronic warfare, it was a first strike in disguise. If it was a system error, it exposed a terrifying vulnerability on both sides. In the Soviet command centers, tension rose not just from the event itself, but from the doctrine it contradicted. The GCI operators, ground controllers, were trained to interpret radar silence as hostile behavior. A missing signal could mean a stealth attack. A blackout could mean a plane was descending to bomb altitude. There was no category in the rule book for radar tracks gone due to unknown cause. That was the first wrong assumption, that their system was foolproof. And once that assumption cracked, everything that followed was built on fear, speculation, and reflex. The Soviet PVO doctrine wasn't designed to wait, it was designed to act. Every MiG-25 patrol flight followed strict procedures, altitude blocks, transponder frequency reports, scheduled radar handoffs, and mandatory alive pings every 90 seconds. If one signal was missed, it was logged. If 2 were missed, GCI control initiated an alert. If 3 were missed and radar contact was gone, the protocol was blunt. Treat the aircraft as hostile or compromised. This wasn't paranoia, it was policy. In a system where NATO bombers could close distance in under 15 minutes from the Norwegian Sea to Leningrad, hesitation wasn't a defensive tactic, it was suicide. And the MiG-25, a 20-ton interceptor built to counter the American B-70 Valkyrie and SR-71 Blackbird, was central to this quick-strike mentality. It was fast, brutal, and doctrinally rigid. But that rigidity was the flaw, because when all 3 squadrons vanished at once, doctrine offered only escalation, activate, secondary SAM radar. Order airborne intercept, scramble standby units. The system left no space for ambiguity. There was no contingency for they may not be gone. The track vanished. So the assumption was either defection, destruction, or deception. And yet the ground crews hadn't reported any emergencies. The onboard systems from last contact recorded no deviation, and GCI radar logs across multiple regions all failed in perfect synchronicity, not likely under normal physics. Still, PVO Command initiated partial alert readiness. Fuel tankers were placed on standby. Border surveillance units were told to increase patrol frequency, and in Moscow, high-ranking officers debated whether NATO had just demonstrated a new capability, one the Soviets couldn't match. Because in the Cold War, unexplained gaps weren't technical mysteries. They were strategic warnings. What scared commanders most wasn't that the MiGs might have been destroyed. It was that they might not have been. That the planes had continued flying, unseen, across radar networks built specifically to see everything. The doctrine had a blind spot not just in coverage, but in imagination. It assumed all failures were external, enemy moves, pilot errors, rogue activity. It had no language for internal collapse, no space for sensors that lied, or data that misaligned. So when the squadrons reappeared, 7 minutes later, right where they were expected to be, the doctrine didn't breathe relief. It went hunting for an explanation that wouldn't break its rules. At 04:13 GMT, 3 squadrons of MiG-25 interceptors, flying a staggered formation at 60,000 feet, crossed into the Northern Patrol Corridor, an arc that looped over the Barents Sea toward the Svalbard buffer zone. NORAD radar systems tracked them clearly at first speed. Altitude. Heading everything was routine, until it wasn't. At 04:14 and 22 seconds, the lead MiG squadron vanished from 2 overlapping U.S. radar networks, a DW line early warning array in Alaska. and an AWACS orbit positioned over the North Atlantic. Then, within 11 seconds, the other two squadrons followed. Total blackout. NORAD operators ran diagnostics. Power was stable. Weather interference was minimal. Ground clutter was ruled out. Yet the three flight groups moving at Mach 2.6 simply ceased to exist on radar. Across the Arctic, Soviet air defense experienced the same event. At 0415 long-range radar stations near Vorkuta and Tixi, both registered contact loss. Transponder handshakes failed. IFF queries returned null. Even ground command link pings timed out. It was a synchronized radar wipeout. The MiGs were still in the air, but no one could see them. It was an impossible event. U.S. Intelligence feared the Soviets had deployed a new radar evading system. A micro-pulse emitter, a passive stealth coating, or worse, electronic countermeasures, ECCM, that didn't jam radar, but spoofed it, feeding ghost data to enemy sensors. In the USSR, panic moved faster. GCI command at Monchegorsk issued a standing order: prepare interceptor reserves. Unknown radar suppression in progress. Then came silence. Command channels between PVO North and PVO Central flooded with conflicting reports. 3 squadrons unresponsive. No hostile engagement detected. IFF interference unlikely, sensor integrity confirmed. The political stakes were immediate. If this was an act of electronic warfare from the U.S., it might justify retaliation. If it was an internal system failure, the Soviet radar net, touted as the most complete in the world, was now compromised. And then, at 04:21:18, the radar returns flickered back. First one MiG, then 5, then all 3 squadrons. Their positions aligned perfectly with pre-vanished trajectories. No speed loss, no altitude shift. It was as if they had flown through an invisible tunnel, only to emerge precisely on schedule. Pilots reported nothing abnormal. Their onboard instruments had been fine. Communications were functioning. The sky had been empty. They had seen no NATO aircraft, no interference, no command directives. They had never known they were gone. For U.S. and Soviet command, the event posed a terrifying question. How do you trust a system that says war is coming, then says, never mind? When the full squadron reappeared on radar at precisely 04:21, confusion gripped every layer of Soviet air defense. Commanders in Severomorsk scrambled to reconcile the return signals with system logs. How could 3 high-speed aircraft simply drop off integrated radar and then rematerialize without deviation, without damage, and without awareness? The first instinct in Moscow was disbelief. General Sergei Dronov, then Deputy Chief of the Air Defense Forces, dismissed the incident as operator error. No trained enemy would allow an entire squadron to vanish. He reportedly told subordinates, the mere suggestion that the U.S. or NATO had the technology to cause a coordinated radar blackout without leaving a trace was considered preposterous or worse, politically dangerous. Instead, the blame turned inward. The official explanation, demanded by the General Staff, was mechanical, faulty radar harmonization between relay stations. Technicians were told to rerun diagnostics. Analysts were ordered to reconstruct the radar timeline to prove no true disappearance occurred. But the radar logs didn't lie. Each disappearance had occurred across multiple radar types, early warning, tracking, and IFF all concurrently, across hundreds of kilometers of network systems, and none of the MiGs had experienced equipment failure. Their telemetry was clean, their fuel use consistent, and their routes unbroken. That's when fear crept in. If the radar blackouts couldn't be blamed on mechanical error or enemy attack, what else could cause such a phenomenon? KGB liaison officers, inserted into PVO command for exactly these crises, began drafting two separate reports, one for the Ministry of Defense and another for the Central Committee. The first stressed a localized radar misalignment incident. The second left room for a more troubling theory, enemy manipulation of Soviet systems via unknown means. But neither theory satisfied the hard truth for 7 minutes. One of the most advanced air defense systems on Earth had no idea where its own planes were and assumed the worst. And that assumption almost triggered readiness changes across the Arctic frontier. Multiple missile batteries had gone to alert stage 1. Two Tu-128 long-range interceptors had been scrambled in expectation of a NATO breach, and 2 mobile nuclear units had quietly prepped their launch checklist just in case. All because Moscow refused to believe what had actually happened, that the system hadn't been attacked. It had failed itself. No sabotage, no defection, no new American weapon, just silence and a doctrine that couldn't explain it. Once the initial panic subsided, Soviet military analysts raced to frame the incident within a comprehensible narrative. The first theory to dominate internal briefings was one as old as radar itself, electronic jamming. It was plausible, it was comfortable, and most importantly, it was external. If the United States or NATO had deployed a new kind of electronic warfare platform, perhaps a high-altitude EC-130 or an orbital signal distortion source, it could explain the synchronized radar blackout across multiple Soviet sectors. The idea wasn't far-fetched, after all. The U.S. had already demonstrated advanced ECM electronic countermeasures during Operation Iron Hand in Vietnam, and more recently during red flag simulations that PVO analysts had been ordered to monitor. Within hours, the Soviet General Staff drafted a provisional hypothesis. The blackout was the result of frequency-hopping jammers capable of mimicking radar signatures while selectively blinding Soviet scopes. They referenced American patents on passive radar interference, and suspected airborne drones near the Greenland Gap might have been the culprits. But this theory crumbled under deeper scrutiny. First, Soviet radar logs didn't show any of the typical signatures associated with active jamming. No signal saturation, no ghosting, no noise spike, and the radar failure hadn't just been distorted, it was cleanly absent. Entire data streams had simply failed to register, as if the aircraft had never existed in the first place. Second, use at radio surveillance didn't change in posture. There were no escalated NATO broadcasts, no shifts in satellite orientation, no aircraft deployments that aligned with an ECM event. Still, the wrong theory stuck. Because in a system built on distrust and secrecy, it was easier to blame a foreign hand than admit to internal failure. Soviet generals briefed the Politburo on potential American electromagnetic cloaking. Despite knowing the internal data didn't support it, it was safer to imagine a NATO capability beyond comprehension than to confess our radar systems failed with no provocation. The wrong theory offered control, the truth offered uncertainty. And in a nuclear world balanced on hair-trigger alerts, uncertainty was the enemy, so they committed to the fiction, quietly initiating new R&D into ghost aircraft detection and ordering counter-jamming drills across the Arctic Circle against a threat that may never have existed. As the jamming explanation lost credibility among Soviet radar engineers, a darker possibility emerged, one that required no new technology, just a terrifying lapse in loyalty defection. To some in the KGB's Military Counterintelligence Directorate, the synchronized vanishing of 3 MiG squadrons wasn't a glitch or an attack. It was intentional, a coordinated effort by pilots to escape Soviet control and deliver advanced aircraft into Western hands. The logic, while speculative, had precedent. In 1976, Viktor Belenko infamously defected in a MiG-25 to Japan, giving American analysts unprecedented access to Soviet aerospace secrets. That betrayal had shaken the air defense forces to the core and created a permanent undercurrent of suspicion around any unexplained aerial anomaly. So when the squadrons disappeared from radar, the idea that they had turned west, flying under the radar, faking a system outage, became an instant internal threat assessment. KGB internal memos speculated that the fallback reappearance was part of a cover. Perhaps the pilots had turned around after failing to secure asylum or running low on fuel. Perhaps it had been a test run. There was no evidence, no communications, no deviation in flight logs, but in the Soviet military intelligence apparatus, evidence was often secondary to suspicion. Flight crews were immediately grounded and isolated for interrogation. The lead squadron commander, a veteran pilot with over 1,000 hours in MiG-25s, was questioned for 14 hours straight. His wingmen had their quarters searched, their family histories reviewed, and their units' previous deployments reanalyzed for behavioral drift. The narrative grew from thin air. Reports speculated about Western agents embedded in aviation academies, about pilots disillusioned by stagnant promotions, about ideological rot creeping into the cockpit. It was a theory fueled not by facts, but by fear, because it gave Moscow an answer that preserved the integrity of their systems. If betrayal explained the radar disappearance, then the radar hadn't failed. The doctrine remained intact. The threat was human, not technological. But this second wrong theory came at a price. It shattered trust within the ranks. Entire squadrons were placed under administrative lockdown. Radar officers were warned not to question inconsistencies in data. Investigators began looking for patterns in other minor anomalies, launching a wave of internal surveillance that crippled morale across multiple regiments. And still, no defection had occurred. The MiGs hadn't left. They hadn't even turned. They had followed orders, flown straight, and returned as planned. But to a system that couldn't admit uncertainty, loyalty itself became a threat. In Washington, D.C., the National Reconnaissance Office flagged the radar blackout as a Category 2 anomaly. CIA analysts working under the Office of Scientific and Weapons Research compiled signal data, ELINT intercepts, and AWACS logs to determine whether the Soviets had revealed a new stealth or counter-radar capability. But the evidence didn't hold up. Despite the dramatic disappearance of Soviet MiGs from NORAD and AWACS radar, there was no electronic warfare signature, no radar jamming, no passive cloaking emissions, no indication that the aircraft themselves were using any known stealth, geometry, or coatings. The MiG-25, a titan of brute force speed, wasn't designed for subtlety. So what happened in a quiet, classified post-mortem 2 weeks later? A junior signal analyst buried 3 floors beneath Langley suggested a far more mundane explanation: a synchronization fault between multiple radar relay nodes. The culprit: a timing drift in one of the primary uplink satellites connecting NORAD's early warning network to airborne radar platforms. Due to a rare sequence of data handshake failures, the system flagged the MiGs as non-existent when the uplink failed to confirm continuous motion. The planes hadn't disappeared. The radar had simply stopped believing in them. This failure was compounded by a newly installed data filter meant to eliminate ghost echoes over Arctic regions, an automated protocol that, in this case, culled real tracks due to apparent data conflict. In other words, the American radar network had been too smart for its own good, but this truth didn't reach the right desks. Because when the CIA sent its brief up the chain, it wasn't the technical explanation that stuck. It was the perception the Soviets might have cracked radar invisibility. That idea gripped imaginations and set off policy tremors from the Pentagon to Brussels. Funding was reallocated. A new directive launched advanced research into near-space radar fusion. Some in the Strategic Air Command even advocated adjusting bomber flight paths to account for potential blind zones. All from a 7-minute sensor drift. On the Soviet side, the intelligence failure was even deeper. KGB SIGINT divisions never realized the Americans had lost contact. Internal reports assumed it was a unilateral Soviet radar failure, prompting costly self-investigations, loyalty reviews, and increased political oversight over air defense assets. Two superpowers, both blind in different ways. One saw phantoms and feared stealth. The other saw betrayal and feared its own pilots. Neither saw the real enemy, a shared faith in infallible systems. While Soviet commanders scrambled to suppress the internal panic and pin blame on loyalty breaches or hypothetical NATO technology, U.S. air defense analysts were quietly building a different kind of response, one rooted in resilience, not control. Unlike the Soviet PVO, the American defense architecture didn't rely on a single integrated radar grid with rigid vertical command. Instead, it depended on redundancy, cross-validation, and decentralization. At NORAD, a radar blackout like the one involving the MiG-25s didn't result in a full system freeze. Multiple independent assets were built into the structure to prevent exactly that kind of paralyzing ambiguity. AWACS platforms like the E-3 Sentry provided real-time, high-altitude radar coverage and downlinked data to multiple ground stations. Over-the-horizon backscatter, OTHB radar systems extended detection ranges deep into the polar approaches, giving broader situational context even if regional radar failed. Space-based surveillance assets tracked heat signatures, trajectories, and velocity vectors even when traditional radar struggled. And most importantly, humans could override the machine. When the MiG tracks vanished, NORAD didn't assume a stealth event. They flagged the anomaly but waited for supporting data. Commanders cross-checked satellite IR feeds, recon drone footage, and AWACS altimetry. Within minutes, one AWACS reported a partial lock from an alternative angle, suggesting the aircraft were still in the sky, even if their radar profiles had vanished. That sliver of data was enough to halt any premature escalation. In the U.S. doctrine, uncertainty was a known constant. It was trained for, simulated, incorporated into rules of engagement. Unlike the Soviet system, which defaulted to worst-case assumptions when data disappeared, the American system had layers of strategic ambiguity tolerance. This wasn't softness. It was survivability. Analysts didn't fear the MiGs were ghosts. They assumed system drift and proved it within the hour. Later declassified notes from NORAD's internal review showed zero movement toward alert escalation. No scrambling of interceptors. No activation of DEFCON changes. Just quiet protocol checks and data syncing. It was a clinical response to a chaotic event. To American planners, the incident wasn't a threat, it was validation. Their system had absorbed an unexpected failure and hadn't tried to shoot first. And that, in the Cold War, was power. Because while the Soviet Union built a system that demanded absolute certainty before every action, the United States had designed one that could keep functioning without it. For the Soviet air defense forces, the reappearance of the MiG squadrons offered no relief, only shame. They hadn't caught a defection. They hadn't uncovered an enemy plot. They hadn't even confirmed a mechanical failure. What they had witnessed was their prized command system's complete inability to process uncertainty without escalating it into crisis. And Moscow knew it. In the weeks that followed, the entire incident was buried under a wall of secrecy. Official logs were amended. Radar operator testimonies were sanitized. Internal memos framed the blackout as a temporary sectoral degradation during electronic load, balancing a phrase designed to say nothing and hide everything. But beneath the bureaucracy, fallout was swift. The lead radar operator at the Vorkuta command node was reassigned. His superior was invited into early retirement. The MiG squadron commander, despite being cleared of any wrongdoing, never flew another long-range mission. His file was marked compromised by anomaly. Doctrine wasn't revised, it was reinforced. New protocols emphasized even stricter reporting, faster escalations, and tighter surveillance of flight crews. The lesson. According to the Politburo, wasn't that the system had overreacted, it was that it hadn't reacted fast enough. Inside Soviet command, fear replaced flexibility. Officers became less likely to report anomalies truthfully. Radar crews began fabricating data continuity to avoid triggering investigations. Trust in the system was no longer about accuracy. It was about protecting the illusion of control. Meanwhile, across the ocean, U.S. analysts debriefed their teams and moved on. There was no scandal, no panic. The incident became a footnote in a broader study on radar synchronization, drift in polar sectors. That contrast, the calm of one side and the institutional spiral of the other, was the true humiliation. Not because the Soviets failed to track 3 aircraft, but because the event revealed what no general could admit. The system worked perfectly, until something unexpected happened. Then it worked against itself. In a war of nerves and networks, that failure wasn't tactical. It was existential. The Soviet Union had built its air defense system not just to protect its skies, but to project an image of invulnerability. A seamless net of radar, missiles, interceptors, and doctrine, all fused into a machine that promised one thing: control. But on that cold Arctic morning, the illusion cracked. 3 squadrons, flying in perfect formation, vanished from the grid, and no one in Moscow could explain why. What followed wasn't a system adapting to crisis. It was a system retreating from reality. And that was the collapse. Because the MiG radar blackout wasn't just a technical hiccup, it was a test. A test of whether the Soviet command could tolerate ambiguity, whether it could investigate failure without defaulting to paranoia, whether it could bend without breaking. It failed on all counts. Rather than reform the data synchronization systems, the High Command deepened its reliance on human suspicion. Rather than empower engineers, it empowered political officers. Rather than interrogate the structure, it interrogated the pilots. The ideology of perfect surveillance demanded one of 2 things: total control or total blame. And in this case, the control was gone, so blame had to fill the void. Even as internal reports quietly confirmed the radar network's flaw, a mismatch in frequency modulation handoffs between sectors, the top leadership buried the findings. Because if the system could lose track of its own planes in peacetime, what would happen in war? The Americans, watching from afar, didn't need to exploit the weakness. They just had to observe it. To U.S. strategists, the MiG blackout proved something profound. The Soviet system couldn't handle what the U.S. system was designed to accept: uncertainty. Where NORAD absorbed data loss and kept its cool, the PVO nearly tripped into escalation. Not because of American action, but because of its own rigidity. and rigidity breaks under pressure. That day, no missiles flew, no intercepts were launched. The Cold War didn't heat up. But in one hidden radar room, the Soviet Union stared at a blank screen and saw its doctrine collapse in real time. Today, the event doesn't appear in textbooks. The radar logs are sealed in forgotten bunkers. The pilots who flew that Arctic patrol never gave interviews. The Soviets never admitted what truly happened. And the Americans, they never had to. But in a conflict shaped by perception, the brief disappearance of 3 MiG squadrons marked a turning point, one not defined by explosions or treaties, but by silence. A few minutes without radar, a few minutes of uncertainty, and in those minutes, a superpower trembled. Because the Cold War wasn't just fought with weapons, it was fought with information and with the fear of losing it. That's what made the MiG blackout so dangerous. It revealed that even the most powerful system could become its own worst enemy when confronted with the unknown. A vanished squadron, an overreaction. A doctrine that collapsed not from outside attack, but from within. If the Cold War had ever gone hot, it likely would have started not with an invasion or a missile, but with an error. A ghost on a screen, a radar track that vanished. And that's why stories like this matter. If you want more declassified Cold War incidents, intelligence failures, and technology that almost changed history, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next near war might already be in the archive.